sometimes when faced with such questions, one tends to really, you sort of tend to formulate things, rather to, it's sometimes you bring things down to a very simplistic level when, when all your writing, all your nonfiction, so much of the work we do is really geared towards showing up this complexity or showing up my own bafflement, my own, failure to understand all these complexities of life. And then sometimes, and so there's really a danger of essentializing things and, sort of just coming down to, how do we represent the Northeast, or how, this is such a tapestry, but how do we sort of engage with it? But having said that, it's also a little bit of a double bind, because at the same time, I have, for instance, edited an anthology where I do use the term Northeast, and you take this, and here I say we in a very, it's a more deliberate usage of the term, because that was really a collection of many women writers and poets and artists. And all of us came together and we sort of tried to, we spent some time trying to think through some of these concepts and what they meant to us. So yes, sometimes, when I really, or when a group of us, or, when we very consciously set out to think through this and to really define ourselves against, and it can also, when I say define, it can also be against the grain of what it means to be pushed into, or what it means to be either pushed into this category or to own this category in a very, again, not in a simplistic manner, but in a fairly, sort of in recognition of all its complexities as well as, but some form of ownership nonetheless. So it's really, so I really see it as a double bind, that at one level, yes, it can be very essentializing. It can push you into simplifications, and sometimes, sometimes, especially when this question is posed against, is posed in terms of, in terms of an obligation almost for us to explain the Northeast, then it becomes, then I think it just becomes tiresome. But yes, it's a double bind, and I think, in some of our works, yes, it is a conscious thing, some of it not so much. I think, Jan, this is a good time for Janice to step in. And, yeah.
Just to go back to, I really do agree with you, Parismita, about, being in this rather awkward space of the double bind, where in a way you're trying to reach out and reach in at the same time, and trying not to essentialize, but trying to, in some ways, make it also accessible for yourself before anyone else. But I do agree with what Nilanjan was saying a little earlier, that there is this quite distinct lack of connections and, sort of relationships even within, the broad sort of northeastern region. And that actually, I noticed this because I tried to travel through the Northeast a lot more in the last few years. It also comes down to the very simple sort of reason of not being very well connected in terms of transport, in terms of, just taking a bus, taking a flight from Guwahati to elsewhere. And it's really difficult. Like, it's not easy to make your way from, say, Shillong, for example, to Kohima, which you would imagine, or Aizawl, so it's often easier to get to these places from Delhi rather than from within the Northeast itself. But I think I'm getting to sort of a slightly bigger point here, which is that when I did try and make these journeys within the, within Sikkim, within Mizoram, it was really quite, just eye-opening, the kind of sort of conversations that you can have, the kind of similarities that we share, a lot of the regions, in fact, given our linguistic regional sort of histories. And that's something that's really been sort of occupying, my sort of headspace for a while. So I might sort of write, as Nilanjan very rightly pointed out, I might, and so do you, Parismita, you write sort of across genres. And I think, sort of we've done poetry, graphic novels, short stories. But I think the thing that, that really truly informs my writing no matter what genre it is the importance of orality. And I sort of have had these conversations with, with writers, young people in Aizawl, in Gangtok, and how, orality plays such an important part in our ways of storytelling. And I think for me, that's the thread that informs all of my literary landscapes, as varied as they might be. As Parismita was saying, sometimes you dip into the landscapes of the Northeast and sometimes you don't, because you as a writer are free to travel. Thankfully, at least in this space, there are no passports and visas yet that stop us from traveling, to other landscapes, to other sort of literary scapes that might inspire you. In that way, my books, my writing has wandered in and out of Shillong, in and out of Cherrapunji, in and out of Assam. But I think what really, for me, remains the strongest presence is, the power of the word, of orality, of recognizing language as breath, and of drawing on those ideas, for my writing, to learn about storytelling in a way that's not confined, to the book, to the text. Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks so much. Very interesting to learn from both of you what sort of goes into the magic of words that you create through your pens and laptops and so on. I was also, since one of the sort of themes in this panel refers to the word tradition, and you mentioned a little bit about the tradition of oral storytelling, but I think, Janice, you yourself have explored Khasi folklore, I think some of the origin myths, and woven that into your works. And Parismita, I'd like you to talk about a specific area which is around this very interesting character in your book, the Hotel at the End of Time. This the ghost of this Japanese soldier who I think is still hunting for his comrades, and it harkens back to the Battle of Kohima. And reading about these things, they certainly take me away from a monolithic view of the Northeast, especially the way people outside it view it, or even maybe people inside it view it, which is very often newspaper reportage of violence and this whole insider outsider business, Bangladeshis, CA, NRC, and it takes you away to a very different world altogether. So would both of you like to speak a little bit about this thing, and maybe even pick examples from your books and stories to sort of make this a little more real to some of our audiences?
Yes, but thank you for bringing up the book, because it was such a long time ago. It just feels like almost like the book was from another life, in a sense. Yes, because because I really because a comic book, and in an initial conversation yesterday, Nilanjan actually suggested that I had the book with me, which I thought, which at that point I was a little unsure of. But yes, I can see how that at least works in terms of you get so yes, some of my my early works, because I've not been doing that much of traditional, this is not traditional, but I've not been doing that much of, long form graphic novels since, yeah. So this is the book that Nilanjan was talking about. It was out in 2009, which is like, oh my God, such a long time ago, right? 2009, yeah, I think that's what it is. So, so he speaks about the Japanese soldier. He speaks about, like, there's this particular story which has a Japanese soldier, and it's interesting because I don't know how I would deal with that same story now, right? It's not. I mean, some of the stories, I think I had, I had a lot of fun with Hotel. Like, I really had a lot of fun with that book. I mean, so for instance, some of it is folklore that I picked up from specific community sources, but some of it is not. It's just like made up stuff, right? Like the Japanese soldier. That I mean, because it seemed like that there is the possibility of such a being traversing those grounds. But since then, it's interesting because since then there's been a lot of work in Imphal and in that area on the whole Second World War, on Second World War tourism, on Second World War history. There's a museum in Manipur now on Second World War artifacts, and I haven't been there yet, but apparently, so I think it's interesting because I think if I were to do the story now, there's so much more material, there's so much available, and so much more work has been done. But at that point, I was lucky to just have not so much. So, I just really had some fun with the story. And I also used it to sort of pay a homage in some ways, which also comes to, I think, brings us back to the first question, which is a little bit about how you are, yes, we do write from the Northeast, but our influences are also come from all over, So, so with that specific piece, I had a lot of fun because I could also bring in an homage to a little bit of Japanese styles. Oh God, I can't find it now. Just give me a moment. Yeah, so I had.
So that ghost found its way into the pages of your book.
Yes.
In not just content but as form as well.
Yeah, so I could do things like, can you make out? So I could do things like, use a little bit of, like, the Japanese painting style and things like that.
This is not manga, is it?
Yeah. I mean, some forms, because there's a lot of, so I could use like a few shots of like Japanese people, because that's such a huge influence when you're doing comics as a young person.
Right.
So it's interesting because yes, there is the whole story now. I mean, there's so much, there is so much work being done right now about the Second World War and its effects and its history in Northeast India, a lot of which has really not been done. And at the same time, I was also able to weave in like the whole Japanese. For instance, there are actually Japanese comics, which as opposed to Indian comics, there are Japanese comics which talk about this journey of, Japanese soldiers who speak of like the battle in Kohima and the important points actually. Yes. So it's odd because, so one can find home, so when you talk of the literary home, right, which is there for a moment, when we read, right, so many of us read, so many of us are sort of, when, no matter where you are, and especially in these times, you may be in a quarantine center, you may be cut off from everywhere, you may be in a bad place as these times are, but sometimes a book, whether you're reading in a digital form or a book, sometimes it allows you that little bit of home, right? For instance, so many people are stuck in places they don't want to be right now, especially people from the Northeast, right? You are. So I think sometimes stories allow you that moment where you can find different homes. So for me, sometimes, it was be like that. You're a young person, you're sort of, you're looking for references, maybe a little bit, you're looking for references of your history, your geography elsewhere, and you don't find it in Indian books. We don't. But I found that, but I would find all these references to the Battle of Kohima in Japanese manga books, translated in French, and but so yes, so I think these journeys are interesting, and geographies are interesting, and how they make their way into our books, our read, the books we read, the books we inhabit, books we momentarily make a home in, and the books we write. I think it's all a part of the.
I recently learned of a very interesting thing about a page out of Mizoram's history, but I'll wait for Janice to respond before I go there.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll just talk a little bit about maybe Boats on Land, which in a way is, I think, of all the books that I have worked on, it's the one that draws on this culture of orality the most. So far, the book that I'm working on right now currently also returns to the literary landscapes of Boats on Land. But for now, Boats on Land is very much an homage in a way to all the early storytellers of my life. So I often get asked, who are your earliest literary influences? And people usually expect me to, give them names of books and authors, and not to say that, they haven't played a large part in, my journey. But in all honesty, my earliest influences were storytellers, so I grew up in Shillong amidst, the Khasi community in Assam, which, oral storytelling flourished. So I'm very, very sort of indebted to these storytellers, to my father, to my grandparents, to families, strangers, friends who could tell a tale, could spin a yarn really, really well, who would be sort of the center of the party, because everyone just has to sit and listen. And of course, the story varies as the number of whiskey glasses sort of accumulate as well, so it's very much sort of part of my memories of growing up. But I'm also interested in not just sort of the folk, culture sort of aspect of storytelling, but of, oral culture as a whole. What does that do, for example, to communities who never quite had a script? What does that do to their ways of remembering? How do they remember? How do they remember their history? How do they mark events, people, places? What kind of part does rumor and gossip play in sort of, social interaction? So I'm really interested in that sort of power of the word, the bigger sort of, idea of orality. And it's something that I wish we would recognize more as a literary form, that there exists many forms of storytelling, books being one, which we all love, but also this, this space of orality, which, given where we come from, Southeast Asia, we are abundant in oral sort of storytelling traditions, and I feel like I wish we could draw on that. I wonder if you know Somi Roy, who is an editor and a filmmaker from Manipur, who sort of has translated his mom, Binodini, her novels and her memoirs. And I remember him once saying a couple of years ago when I met him that he really wants to hold an oral storytelling festival where people will just come from all over Rajasthan. It's not just sort of bound to the borders of the Northeast at all, where you come and you listen to hear. So for Boats on Land, that played a huge part in the writing of those stories, because if you notice, there are many people telling stories within the stories. So it's sort of this slightly, mirror within a mirror kind of structure.
I just wanted to, know your views on, a lot of you are sometimes seen as representing the Northeast through your writings, and you within people who stay in the Northeast, you are sometimes seen as representing their voices in the way that, for example, a film like Akhuni has been considered by many to be either good or bad, whatever it is. But it was, since it was novel and since it was new, and since it is one of the few voices in that sort of medium, it was considered to be a representative, sort of document on what this whole term Northeast means. And then it has had its reactions, good, bad, ugly, whatever it is. But do you sometimes feel this pressure or pleasure of writing about the Northeast with all its complexities and all the different types of forms that you deal with? So pressure, pleasure, both.
I think Janice should go first. I've been doing all of it. I took all the other questions. You should totally. I just see you, you're just dying to get in.
No, absolutely not.
It's a favorite question.
Janice, for example, it's going to be difficult for you to shake off the tagline Northeast writer.
I've been trying.
No matter how far you get. That's so wicked, Nilanjan.
I know. Wait till I come to Bangalore. Wait, just wait. I mean,
it's like, best female CEO or some such thing. So it's that sort of tagline that you're going to have a tough time fighting off. Sorry.
That's quite funny, actually. Yeah.
Yes, I shall add that to my sort of resume. It's always a tricky question. It's always a tough question to answer, and it's always a question I think that you're asked. And I'm wary of it for many reasons. Like one of the main ones being that it comes, I think, from a space then that assumes a monolithic identity, from within which this supposed representation springs. And I think that's a really dangerous sort of uncomfortable space to be in, not only because it places, a tremendous pressure on the person who is meant to do the representing, but also because in a way it disallows or dishonors the many stories that exist then within the space that you're meant to be representing. There is such plurality and such multiplicity and so many lives living at these overlapping cross sections of traditions and culture, and it's so magnificently rich. And as Parismita was saying right at the beginning, that you're in some ways baffled by the richness and the complexity of the space that you come from. That to kind of essentialize and to bring it down to this one singular kind of representation seems to me an act of thievery in some way, as though we're robbing the space of these incredibly rich stories that deserve to be told, that must hold their own space, that must be sort of allowed to be told. I mean, I don't see anyone being asked, how do you feel representing the west of India or the north of India? So I just feel like, we know now, it's 2020, it is, an exceedingly complex, interwoven, intricate, ethnic sort of, cauldron. That in fact, I just watched a video the other day that said that if you cut the Northeast off from the rest of the country, it will still be the second most diverse place on earth. So, it's just so, incredibly ethnically complicated. So I would feel tremendous sadness if that were the case.
Sure.
Yeah.
Parismita?
Okay. So
Really, you feel strongly about this.
Yeah.
Janice.
No. I've calmed down since.
And rightly so, I guess.
No. So I have a responsible and an irresponsible. I have a responsible and an irresponsible response to this. So which one would you like?
The irresponsible one.
That one first? Okay.
Always.
So basically, So basically, so offhand, it's basically if you just dish this question out to me in the market while I'm buying fish or something. So here is what I would say then, which is that, my writing or my comics or whatever, this is not a tableau for the Republic Day. Do you know what I mean? That everything cannot be reduced to this, right? That, it's this, what you do. I don't know if, do people still watch that? Like on Republic Day, you have these tableaus.
Yes.
That represent every state, and and the last couple of ones, if you're not good enough through the year, your tableau may even get knocked out. So basically, so writing can't come down to that. No, it can't be like this. Yeah. So it really can't be a question of so this is the representative from Assam, or sometimes that's happened. Suddenly they'll get all these writers and say, oh, suddenly we have too many people from one place or something like that, and the other, yes, now we need a mix. So they'll call up, say, oh, I need one person from, yes, isn't it? See, Janice is laughing. Yeah. So this, so it really is. This is so this whole question of representation and Northeast it sometimes is a bit tiresome, because you also want your writing to be sort of judged on other bases, or to be seen from other perspectives. Yeah. Okay. So yes. So yes, this whole question of representation.
Answer, and then you would go buy the fish.
Yes. So yes, because in Rujanvada we are like very at that point we are sort of very like, yeah, we speak very cleanly when we are buying. So so the whole question of representation is really not something that I mean that it's representing the Northeast. That's really something that I don't take any claim for. Okay, but the responsible response to this is that no matter what, is that no matter how much I sort of rage against it, it's not something that can be wished away. And when I say this very deliberately, in the sense that maybe this is not something that is explicitly being said to you, right? But it is something that may come in the way. I'm sure it doesn't happen to everyone, but it may come in the way when editors are commissioning work. When you're writing for a range of issues. If you're a freelance writer or a young person, I'm also not sure how many people watching are sort of are looking to gain a step into publishing or writing or journalism, or particularly about and may have specific region specific pitches, right? So then here the whole question of representation then becomes a very real issue, right? Because then often when you're the person who needs when you need to be able to send in that article, when you need to be able to publish something, it's really hard, and it's hard to do these negotiations, right? If constantly there's going to be this burden of representation of some kind of some mythical Northeast, or some and as we know, I don't even have to get into that, all those cliches of particular of conflict or insider outsider, or all these angles that they constantly want from you. And if you have a different story, you're the kind of person who's able to find these different stories, you're a young person trying to push these stories, then this is a hard thing to do. So in such a situation, I would say that sometimes if it's sometimes maybe you have to give in a little bit for edits and all of that, but I would also say that I think it's also a good idea to sometimes fight back, to sometimes fight back a little bit and say, just because Akhuni worked, it doesn't mean that all of us have to dress up in our national costumes and last thing. I haven't seen the film though, right? I've just seen the trailer, but this whole like, so what I mean is that if you feel strongly about your story, you feel strongly about the about the region, about and there is a burden of representation, I think sometimes one should fight back. Yeah. And and at least make sure your editor hears your side of the story, that no, this is essentializing, and not fear too much. Yeah. So I mean, these are the two.
I think what Parismita is saying is, is so true, because there are also writers who I know from Assam, from other parts of the Northeast, who actually draw great strength from this identity and from this place, and from in some ways feeling like they are a voice for some of their people, for some of their community, and they draw great strength from that. So of course, there's I think it does depend, of course, who you ask. It does depend on the situation, but absolutely, I mean, I think it's always a little, that's sort of double edged.
Yeah, I think the whole double bind plays out.
Yeah, double bind is like the
always.
Yeah, in fact, I was thinking double bind. I didn't say that, or triple, or it's like a multiple. Yeah, it's really like these multiple bind.
So one of the double binds that I'd like to just like you to talk about a little briefly, because we're at 3:45. I think about 5-7 minutes before we hand it over to the audience questions. Very quickly, Parismita, I think you've grown up in the Kokrajhar area, or you I'm not sure where you've grown up, but you are right now in Guwahati, but
yes,
your work,
now, but I haven't
but your work has talked about the Bodoland, Bodoland issue, and your work in Pratham also takes you to those spaces. But now you're in Guwahati, which might in some senses be like any other Indian city.
We are under curfew here.
Yeah, that's why it's like any other Indian city right now.
Yeah, yes.
And no, but I mean, I also see some sort of homogenizing happening within urban centers. It's not that it is stark or extremely rapid now, but I do see that sort of homogenizing happening across multiple large cities. If you take the top 20, 30 cities of India, some amount of homogenizing I do see happening in my limited experience. So, but you still continue to stay in the Northeast in Assam, whereas somebody like me or Janice has been out of it for a while now. So how does this whole business of being physically present or absent uh, influence your thinking, your sensibilities, and and therefore your writing and the sort of things that you do? You hearken back to nostalgia and to memory, or do you feel inadequate that you will not be able to write something which is adequately nuanced on contemporary issues, and therefore you go back to the past? How does this whole thing work out, the business of location? Janice, you want to go first?
Yeah.
Well, I feel like this answer, might be sort of made more weighty or poignant if there was an original point of fixture to begin with. In the sense that, having grown up in Shillong and then moving away and then living sort of in Delhi or wherever else. But I've never really had a fixed point to move away from in some ways, because my father worked in the tea industry in Assam for many, many years. I was born in Assam. In fact, I was born in Jorhat. And so we've moved around all my life. And it was always sort of a shuffling between Shillong, where my grandparents and extended family were, and the tea estate that my parents happened to be transferred to at that point in time. So it's always been a shifting. So in a way, it's always been a journey of migration for me, and it hasn't really ended, I think, because I always feel like wherever I am, it's sort of, okay, for now, we'll see how things go. Just maybe because it's just sort of been embedded in my psyche, so deeply. So in that sense, as cliched as this may sound, I just have many places which I consider home. Delhi, of course, being one. Come and go from this city. I lived a little while in the UK. And of course, Shillong, where mom and dad are and extended family are. So it's always a shifting point on the horizon for me. And I think that, this is also why I feel quite wary of the label that, I'm a Northeast writer, because my heart and my interests lie in many places. Although, of course, having grown up and having come from the Northeast, that's, a different kind of embedding that happens, of course. But I'm, given my sort of slightly migrant ways, I'm just interested in a lot of things in a lot of places. For the book that I'm currently working on, just to answer your question a little more precisely, I was actually meant to be in the West Khasi Hills, in the Southwest Khasi Hills, all of this summer before the monsoons hit, to do research, to make a research trip. And I'd gotten in touch with people, and I knew which little villages I wanted to go to and speak to people there. And of course, I have been completely stuck and unable to do that. So I think that in a way I know Shillong best and closest, but if I'm writing about different parts of Meghalaya, I still need to make that research trip. Just as I would need to make a research trip, I don't know, elsewhere in the world. Do you see what I mean? Yeah, so it's not so much the geography of the place as much as, this kind of continuous movement that I've kind of seen all my life.
Immersion during the course of your ambulatory life,
Yes,
so to speak.
yes, exactly.
Parismita, a quick response, because I think we're
Yes.
3:50 right now.
Okay, so yeah, okay, so basically we were speaking about like all the location, right? Yeah. So the big thing about location is of course is the diverse communities, right? So I lived for many years in Delhi. Hotel at the End of the World was written in Delhi. Yeah. So the question of location is also about like the imagined community, it's also about the communities we forge where we lived. And I lived very long and very hard years in Delhi, in terms of security, and there were a lot of challenges, but there was also a very, very vibrant community which comprised of, and Delhi is sometimes a space where, it's not so much Delhi as in the particular space and the particular time and the particular income level I was at in Delhi. That also makes a big difference. So if you lived in an urban village in Delhi, you did actually have a very good exchange across people across Northeast, right? And I think those years were very rich in terms of in terms of communities, and many of these communities were pan northeastern in that sense. There was a lot of activism at that point. A lot of the students unions, a lot of the issues of the Northeast would also find a voice. They still do. And so what I mean to say is that there was that community there was a particular community that did inform hotel as well. And of course the big change about the kind of community that I have had to encounter or deal with in Guwahati is that I have a child now, right? So the minute you have a child, your whole relationship, your whole relationship to the idea of the individual and the community, that is completely that is completely, how should I put, it's really shaken up, right? Because the and for me, so the Guwahati I know, the hill I know, the area I know is also very much through the prism of caring for a child, of having a young child. So the area, so the Guwahati I know will be very different from if I had known this city as a student, for instance, right? So there are also these other factors which I think play as much a role in our perception of a city and the communities we form there, which of course will all come down to affect influencing our writing. Yeah.
So as a mother of a 5-year-old, your location has now shifted to the periphery of rubber dinosaurs and things like that.
No, not the periphery at all. Rubber dinosaurs are totally central to everything.
No, around the rubber dinosaurs and the child, that's the center. Yeah. So, okay, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts, but I think the audience wants to know more. So I'll just pick up a few. We have several questions. Let me just read through a couple of them. Maybe Parismita, you can take this one. The question is from Shibani Fukan. Given how contemporary the genre of the graphic novel is, do you have a target audience in mind when you work on it? Does the form limit the content or the audience?
I feel like we might have lost Parismita.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Parismita, are you there?
Yeah, she's sort of
frozen.
Should we give her a second to just come back? That was a question.
I think she's logging back in.
Yeah.
While she's coming in, let me get your views on something. Maybe this is something that either of you could take up, or maybe Janice until she comes back. How does gender impinge on the many identities that you live with in your writing? And maybe this comes from the person's reading of your Nine-Chambered Heart. I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Right.
Did you hear the question? How does gender impinge on the many identities that you live with in your writing?
That I live with.
Yes.
in my writing? Well, it's not a question of impinging as much as being in some ways always present. I feel like it's not something that I feel like impinge has maybe the connotation of intrude upon, perhaps, when it's not really the case. I think for a lot of my writing, I'm interested in how, and this is sort of at the heart of my novel Seahorse. I'm interested in ideas of queerness, in gender as being, on a spectrum, fluid and sort of unfixed. And that takes precedence in Seahorse for sure, because it has queerness very much at its heart. In a lot of the Boats on Land stories, it is I'm in fact, in the main story in the collection, it is about young love, and young love at a time when we haven't quite been told or been schooled in who we should love. In the sense that our desires transgress all sorts of boundaries, and I'm interested in that transgression. So if you take a look at the main story in Boats on Land, that's sort of one of the deep undercurrents of that story. With Nine-Chambered Heart, it's very much the idea of a person, in this case very much, particularly intentionally so, a woman at the heart of the story, in some ways being narrated about by mostly male characters, but not all. And I think in Nine-Chambered Heart, I was interested in the construction of an identity, and an identity that, very definitely happened to be a woman, and how, the stories that are told around her, about her, by these different characters, and how, in a way, it is a very fragmented identity that is put into place. So I think what might link all of the books in some ways, or sort of, the at least when it comes to gender, is that, there is this journey of discovery, that it is not a fixed point, that, a character is this way and will remain this way, but that, gender is fluid, not just in the way that, of course, we understand it, but it also is a constant discovery of, oneself. And, that's sort of the most comfortable space for me, at least when it comes to gender and writing. Yeah.
Thank you. Parismita, you just vanished when the question was posed to you. It wasn't such a tough question that you had to duck it. But I will pose it back to you. So Shibani Phukan wants to know, given how contemporary the genre of the graphic novel is, do you or did you have an audience, a target audience in mind when working on it? And did the form of it limit the audience and or the content? And if I may add a little bit to that, and or the challenges of getting it published, because graphic novels are not, I think, even now welcome all that much by publishers.
So thank you for the question. It's nice to get graphic novel questions. So yes. So the thing is, Shivani, the point where I wrote, the time when I wrote Hotel at the End of the World, we were there were many of us in Delhi and across, and we were wildly optimistic about where the graphic novel was going. A little bit, I think, which turned, I don't know if it really lived up to its promise in that sense, but we were actually really optimistic that it was going to, that as a form, it was going to take off, and that it would have a wider following, and or at least it would be of it would interest people, and people would get so the question of the question of age group was really something I didn't think of at all. But I was in the sense that, because with graphic novels, the thing is that because there are pictures, it's always possible that younger people are going to pick it up, right? And the more you tell them that it's not for you, that it's an 18+1, and there's violence and there's sex and that kind of thing, it's much more, it's more likely that young people will pick it up, right? So with graphic novels, you really don't think of age that way. But yes, because at that point, publishers were a little more optimistic about the future of the graphic novel, because they had just, it's been a couple of decades, they had re-christianed it graphic novel from the comic book and so on. So yes, I think so I think at the hotel we marketed it more or less as a book for everyone, that we didn't really look at it in terms of, we didn't really bother to send it out to school libraries or that kind of thing. I think it was marketed like any other fiction book, right? As you and that's a very interesting question, Nilanjan, or whether do you think it limited, whether the form, I think form never limits, marketing does sometimes, and distribution, and and a whole lot of other things, because that's the other thing that you slowly yes, that's the other thing that you slowly come to understand of the book business, that yes, it's really, as writers, we put in a lot of work, and you write the book, and that's all very good, but at the same time, there is a whole, there are a whole lot of other things that also go into the question of distributors and publishers and printing quality and so on, right? So the printing, for instance, makes it a bit of many publishers a little wary that they don't move that fast, and also printing costs go up a little bit, especially if you're looking at full color graphic novels or something like that, right? So I think I haven't actually pushed a graphic novel. I haven't really sort of tried to publish another graphic novel since then, so I don't really know how much attitudes within the industry have changed and so on. But I'm not feeling. But I also feel that as a form, I think it could be. I think there was so much optimism at one point. Again going back to Shivani's question, that NCERT textbooks were using a lot of comic books sequences, right? So there was really this potential of being able to reach out to students, being able to go into curriculum, being able to be taken seriously as a piece of fiction. So I'm not sure how all of it has come out, because now there's so much digital content, right? Which would actually make it ideal for a graphic novel to be, for graphic novel reportage, for graphic novel stories could be. But I don't see as much of it as I imagine there should be, because... In fact, right, yeah.
Just speaking from personal experience, as recently as 2018, when Shillong Times was published, I had originally written the whole thing out as a graphic novel.
Really?
I'd written all the panels. I had sort of figured out what sort of visuals would be there, but I can't draw to save my life. So I was working with an artist who would, Gocchini Udergio type of project is what I had in mind.
Wow.
But
what made you change your mind then, or change the form?
Because I went to a whole bunch of publishers and they said, we don't do graphic novels, or we won't do graphic novels. Your story has great potential. And then finally, Speaking Tiger said, we think you should just convert this into a novel, because, and they had some good reasons beyond the reasons of marketing and stuff like that. So we had an analysis of the whole book, and I sort of agreed with them that, all right, this amount of stuff I'm trying to convey, maybe the graphic novel may not be the best form, although it seemed very attractive to me at that point. Anyway, that's
no,
so.
but thank you, Nilanjan. That's such an amazing story. I'm going to totally repeat it in the next graphic novel question. I mean,
the resistance is still
you actually had a graphic novel, and they made you convert into prose. Wow.
The only thing is that I hadn't drawn out or hadn't got the artist to draw out.
No, that's not required. Like if you've written I mean, you're not even required to do that, right? I mean, some of the most famous graphic novels are done as partnerships, but the very fact that you conceptualized it as a graphic novel, that's very rare, for someone to actually put it down. Like people do it vice versa, like you have the prose first and then, you convert. But yeah, this is a really, really cool story. But it's done so well, your book. So yeah.
Do you feel that it managed to, to sort of retain what you wished to retain, or that it managed to embrace everything that you wish to put into the graphic novel into the novel better? Is that how you feel?
I think when you change form, you lose something and you gain something, and I think this is what happened as well. One of the reasons that I wanted to be a graphic novel, you call me a diehard nostalgist or whatever it is, but I wanted to have some sense of the Shillong that I grew up in, and however cliched it sounded, it was pine trees and blue hills and whatever it is, mist over the hills and stuff like that. Now when I go to Shillong, I feel very blue, quite frankly, with the amount of urbanization, etc., that's happened. So I wanted to have that picture of Shillong once, because it's gone and will never come back. And but anyway, that's
almost like a visual record for.
Correct, and out of my mind to some place more useful. Question from Lasya. She's a travel writer and she's found the Northeast very challenging, but an amazing experience. Arunachal, she's traveled across to write a guidebook. I think the question is, she's from South India, but I think a question will interest many other people here as well. Simple one. We've talked about complexity and, the whole umbrella, the simplification of the Northeast. So she's asking what your favorite books and maybe even traditions are from the Northeast, which I suppose adequately represents this plurality and so on. So your favorite works from the Northeast and maybe even traditions. So Janice, you want to go first?
I have, if it helps, there's a little Instagram post that I made with the help of quite a few people from Shillong, from other places, and we put together a reading list, and we named it very unimaginatively the Northeast reading list. But well, it gives you a list of 25, 30 books that all of us felt mostly nonfiction as to begin with, because we're still working on more, it's not an exhaustive, authoritative list at all, but at least a list to begin with in that way. There's a whole mix of writers in there. I mean, it really depends. I mean, some of my favorite fiction is, there's Chetan Raj Shrestha's The King's Harvest, which I really love. There's, Esther Inkire, who's written so many fantastic novels. There's Temsula Au, of course, Mamang Dai, whose poetry I love. There's Robin Ngangom, who's Manipuri but has lived in Shillong all his life and writes the most, fantastic poetry. There's Kinpam Singh Nongkanri, who's also a wonderful poet and a playwright. So there's many of these, which I hope the little list will help you. But I think what's interesting, at least for me, just to take the question a little further, is that the forms of storytelling within, say, a place like Shillong has really, really changed. There's rap music, there's now films being made, there's, of course, the poetry and the songs. But I think it's been very exciting to see how so many newer forms of if not new forms of storytelling, but how many different forms of storytelling have kind of been embraced by young people. They're fantastic, rappers who are, really politically sort of active as well, and are singing just fantastic music. There's a Jaintia movie, boom in the Jaintia Hills, perhaps related to the coal mining. I don't know, but maybe that's where the money is coming from. So there's all of these exciting new media things also happening, if we look at it traditionally, we had the figure in sort of the Khasi community. We had the figure of the Nonknya, who was the bearer of the word, the storyteller for the community. And I think what's been interesting is to see how that Nonknya has taken so many shapes and forms now, lately.
Parismita?
Yes. So I actually suggest, oops, again, sorry, I think my bandwidth is really shaky. So I would really, suggest just pick up translations, because already Janice has sort of named a lot of the people writing in English who have been translated and so on. But I would seriously suggest, if you're reading in English and you want to read across the things, one thing that I have found terribly useful is all the Sahitya Academy translations, So you have all your poets, so it's, of course, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's still great. The books are very reasonable.
Sometimes translations are a little not so great. Yeah.
Yes. But I would still suggest that if you want to look for translations, you still get a much wider range, If you want to look across, if you want to read across the Northeastern, you want to read across the Northeastern states, that is one. I mean, personally, I've been reading a lot of Assamese writers, but see, that's the problem now. I can't I would say just totally get, try and pick up anything by Urupa Patongya, which has been translated, because I'm reading in Assamese. So two people I'm reading a lot of Saurav Kumar Soliha, who is also, who I'm sure has also been translated, but I'm reading in Assamese, so it's a little difficult to figure out what their translations are at the moment. But so Janice's list is already very useful. It's a great first step. And other than that, just pick up any translation, give it a try. You don't really have to, it's great to have a list, but also I found that very useful, like just to go and pick up all these translations and see where it takes you.
Yeah, thanks. You feel free to take or not take this question. I was, I thought it was a little related to the multiplicity of forms that Janice was just speaking about, films from the Jaintia Hills and so on. And this is about a film that's making the news these days, which is Akhoni. Somebody wants to know what, to both of you, if you would like to take it and if you've seen it, what your thoughts are. And he says the film, or she says, I don't know, Jean, the film was critiqued for showing reverse racism. I'm not very sure what this reverse racism thing is, but whatever it is, it was about racism in some form. So would you like to respond, or we can skip it?
I haven't seen
the
film.
Parismita hasn't seen it.
So Janice, so it won't be really fair. I have my opinions on it, but it probably won't be very fair. So Janice,
I can speak very briefly if you want. I did watch it recently. And of course, I do think that despite all there's been a lot of criticism launched at it, and a lot of it, rightly so. But, there are things to applaud. The fact that, it's a filmmaker from the Northeast, from Shillong in particular, making a film and having it sort of accessible on a platform like Netflix. It's not the most common of occurrences. So I think that, there's always that to applaud, that it's happened. If nothing else. My other great relief was that Priyanka Chopra was not playing any mandatory role in the film. I was very happy to see that she had no part in it at all. Huge relief. And I think that the entry point that, Nicholas chose, which was food and the politics of food, I think that was it has its problems for sure, but I think that was a poignant entry point, something that is very much about community and about, well, home. Where can you cook your food that makes it home for you in that sense. So it was sort of a poignant entry point. It did kind of get mislaid along the way, but I think there are these things to applaud about the film. I think the thing that made me most uncomfortable was this kind of Northeast United team that everyone was sort of clubbed into, it just felt a bit like they were all interchangeable in some ways, with no backstory or individual sort of character story at all. But even that aside, if you're trying to kind of put everyone in, and how do you do that? You kind of have to essentialize, which is what happened. There's no one from Assam, and I think there's no one from Tripura. So, these were the kind of criticisms being launched at the film. But I think for me, what deeply, deeply disturbed me was right at the end, when there was, there was a scene where the victim of racist sort of violence was victim blamed in a way that, I think what was more disturbing was that it was perpetrated from within the community, that it was, his girlfriend who was saying, well, you don't make any effort to make friends with people, they're kind of nice to us, on the day that she has been sort of slapped by this, hooligan on the street after sort of, sexually harassing her as well. Anyway, so that for me, the end really sort of, dismantled a lot of the film for me. That scene of, that shift, I don't know, almost as though it was making, a supposed projected audience happy in that way, rather than actually really getting down to the thick of it. And of course, this sense that why are these people here? These people, a lot of, the Northeast migration, we were just having a quick chat about this yesterday, that, they are driven out of their regional homelands because of resource extraction, because of environmental degradation, because there are no jobs, there are no employment possibilities. And, that's what drives a lot of the migration out from the Northeast. And also, of course, it's a frontier that's used as a resource-rich sort of, extraction hole. Sorry, I should stop.
But, no, I think I think one reason the film has created so much of news is that it's the burden of being first in a way. I mean, not that there haven't been other firsts in films from the Northeast. I mean, there have been filmmakers, but I think this particular sort of story is probably one of the first, and also coming out on a platform which allows a much wider audience than if it was a traditional multiplex or something.
You're right, Nilanjan. I mean, after like decades of misrepresentation and lack of representation, it's, one movie, what really can it do, I guess? I don't know. Yeah.
I think, like
so
one reviewer said, sorry. Yeah, go on.
No, but there have been so many good. See, also, I think, the thing is, yes, Netflix is new, but, in the old, like, whatever, just about, say, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there would be Northeastern films that would be screened and do darshan and all of that. Some of them are very good. Like, you watch films from across the country, right? So I presume someone sitting in Delhi would have watched an Assamese or a Manipuri or an Arunachali film at that point as well. And there were some very good films as well then. So I don't know if, Netflix and Akuni is really the first time that people are getting a chance to, it's a little bit, I think.
No, I'm just talking about the scale. I think the scale is different because it is on Netflix. Immediately the scale changes from a TV show which is at a fixed hour and
No. I'm talking about Doordarshan, like say about, when they would do their regional afternoon films. That would have been, they were the only people around then. So, but I mean, what I mean is that, yes, Netflix is recent and lots of people are logging in, but I think but I think people did watch more. I think we did have a more diverse watching and, reading thing a little bit earlier as well. Maybe it's now that things are getting.
Yeah.
Okay, we have just about 5-10 minutes left, so I'd like to shift gears from you folks being, from your avatar or your role as commentators to writers once again. And the two questions. I apologize, Janice, but somebody wants to know the inspiration behind the short story, The Last Touch. Is that from your collection?
Gosh, I don't remember it now.
But Parismita, is that from yours?
No.
No, then it's definitely yours.
It's a short story. Okay, right. It was published.
In fact, Ria is the person who's asking, and she says, to quote her verbatim, the inspiration behind your beautiful short story, The Last Touch. And similar question for Parismita. How did you come up with the story for Looking for Mongru? That comes from Ria again. So I think she's read both your books and she. So you want to go first, Parismita? Looking for Mongru?
Yeah, actually, yes. I mean, so this is one of those questions that I actually have an answer to. It was basically, there was that one image there was one image of a person in a village who was walking around with a flute shaped like a gun. So there was somebody who was just walking around with, that's the story, right? Yeah, I think so. See, yeah, even I've had to like catch my breath a little bit and be like, yeah. So I think the central trope of that story is really like this person who has a flute gun, right? So yes, I saw someone with a gun just like that, beautifully fashioned out of wood, and carrying it on his shoulder. And this was someone not really going anywhere. And I think that's where, and I carried that image with me for a very, very long time. And I think that's where eventually the story came from. But thank you for this question. Yeah,
that's really fantastic. I wish I had something as poignant, but mine is more just, I'm deeply interested, especially within the form of the short story, on focusing on brief, fleeting encounters between people who perhaps normally might not really have been placed in each other's way. And the story is about exactly that. This young woman from India who's traveling alone, and she stays with a couple in Lucerne, and she becomes sort of friends with the woman there, and it's just them in that brief little moment of time and how they connect. And I'm deeply interested in sort of these deep friendships between women that seem to really move across these borders of friendship and love and desire, and they sort of occupy this very, very special kind of space, and yeah, that's sort of where the heart of the story comes from that, the encounter between these two young women and how it leaves them changed.
Okay. This question has been asked twice. I think we've discussed this, but anyway, if there's something you'd like to add, because we are almost, I'm afraid this will be the last question. Sorry to the others who asked, but we really don't have any more time. I think about 5 or 6 questions we're not able to take up. But the question is, speaking of tokenistic representation, can you tell us more about your experiences and how we should stop looking at the Northeast through the same generic lens? Why are we still struggling to represent, to address this problem of representation better? I think we've spoken a little about it, but if you want to have a quick response to this, that would be great.
Yeah, please, Parismita.
Yeah. Yes. So I think, yes. So actually, yes, Nilanjan is right. We did we did touch upon it with various points of the conversation right today. And I think, what I could also do is give it a slightly more, give it a twist to this and wonder and, and see that. And since my last book was about communities and people, this is also something I had to really watch out for. I mean, this is something that I consciously watched out for the editing phase at my own work, right? That because, one also, yes, um, in the sense that these are, I think questions of privilege, right? So there are many that works at many levels. Yeah. So when I stand here, I don't want to say that I'm, this is not something that all of us at some point or the other, we have to make these choices about, how we treat our neighbors, how we, how we look at how we write about the various communities, especially communities who have a history of representation in that sense, who have been written about, and what your caste, your class, your religious and other baggages vis-a-vis them. So I think so, also, so what so all the questions that you've asked, I think are very, I mean, so your question is very pertinent, and it is something that that doesn't just, it isn't all just only limited to the idea of lit fest, or calling or reviews, or inviting writers for panels and that kind of thing. It also applies, I mean, for me it also applies when I do my work. I also try to make sure that I that I address these questions where my own work is concerned. So thank you. Yeah.
Janice, I'll ask you a different question, which I need to necessarily, because it's being asked by the host, which is Team Belong, and therefore we are duty bound and honor bound to provide us some sort of response in the next 3 minutes or so. The question is, what are some of the best writing and literature publishing houses, programs, or fellowships in the Northeast India or the world? And if they've been successful, what are the key principles behind their success? I have no idea about any of these things, but Janice, maybe you could take this one up.
I mean, in the world, that's a bit sort of, I think, beyond the scope.
The MacArthur Grant.
Well, in the Northeast, and I think this is what we were talking about yesterday, that actually we don't quite have the publishing houses,
Many of them, yeah.
Of fellowships, residencies like that.
Yes. There are a few, I would imagine much more so in places like Assam and Manipur, which have a history of written, they have a writing tradition, writing and I would assume printing tradition, even though we were talking also about how it's a problem of capital that, we just seem to not be able to put in the money to start up publishing houses where they are required to be. In a place like Meghalaya, I know that it's also because we've had a lot of theological text literature being published, but not so much anything else in Khasi especially, although that is changing. Residencies in the Northeast, as far as I know, I don't know of any. I think there was one that was happening in relation to the Zero or the Orange Festival in Arunachal, where they were giving a residency space to a writer or an artist during the festival. So that might be something you could look into. Sorry, what else was the question?
I think we'll have to end it here unless you have a few proper nouns to quickly throw out, Parismita, in just proper nouns and names.
That's okay. I think fellowships would be great, I think, for aspiring writers, younger writers. Yeah.
Okay, if you're aware of any, can you name any?
There's Zuban, the Fragrance of Peace grants, but that's for non-fiction.
Zuban?
Zuban Fragrance of Peace grants, where they give out
Fragrance of Peace. Okay, so maybe that's one.
Yeah, but it's for research and non-fiction.
It's for research and non-fiction.
Okay, we are at 4 29 and we have to end. I think Sharanya is has beads of perspiration. We're going to be off now. Thank you. It was really nice. It was a pleasure, a delight to speak to you, Janice and Parismita. I learned a hell of a lot before and during the sessions, and I learned a lot about myself and the place I came from through your eyes and through your experiences. And I hope so do the participants. I'm sorry we couldn't take all your questions, but well, thank you all. Is there any quick, famous last words from you, Janice or Parismita?
No, I think, no, thank you, Nilanjan, for really putting this together, and Sharanya and the entire team at Belong.
Thank you, guys. It was actually a really good session. We got some really interesting questions from the audience. So thank you to everyone who was watching and paying attention so well. But yeah, Nilanjan, you were a really great moderator, and this really felt like a living room session that we got, like a sneak peek into. It felt so organic and so natural. So thank you for doing such a good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And wish you all the very best in these COVID times. Stay healthy.
Thank you so much. You too. Stay safe.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Lots of love to your mom and dad. Okay.
Thank you, Janice. You too.
Bye-bye.